Welcome to the Freedom to Learn podcast. I'm your host, Ginny Gentles. This season, we're diving into what it means to return education to states, communities, and families. And we're exploring what becomes possible when education is freed from union dominance and federal control. Education should be about learning, not activism. That shouldn't be a controversial statement, but in school districts controlled by powerful unions and activists, academics are no longer the top priority. And unfortunately, many states and districts embrace activist-driven initiatives and policies that violate federal laws in the name of DEI, gender, and other ideologies. Erika Sanzi, Senior Director of Communications at Defending Education, joins me today to talk about her organization's efforts to investigate and expose when states and districts cross the line. Sometimes the states and districts are clearly violating federal laws, like Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, or Title IX, FERPA, or PPRA. Sometimes they're violating the trust of parents. Too often, they're prioritizing the demands of activists over the needs of students. Defending Education recently sent letters to leaders in all 50 states calling for them to undertake legal housekeeping and ensure that schools operate lawfully, transparently, and in the best interests of students and families. Erika and I discuss what prompted those letters. Erika Sanzi is a former educator and elected school board member. She's also the mother of 3 sons. Erika Sanzi, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Ginny Gentles, thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited that we're talking today. We're pals outside of the education policy world that we work in. So this is a fun opportunity for me, particularly because we're going to be delving into topics that are outside my subject matter expertise. And really pleased that you're here to kind of walk me through it. Before we dig into the policy side of things, I'd like to talk about your personal background. You may be the first former teachers union member that I've had on the podcast. So tell us a little bit about your experience as a teacher. And then also you served as a school board member in Rhode Island.
Yep. Oh my gosh, it feels so long ago. I'm getting so old. So I was a member of the NEA in 2 states. I taught for 4 years in Massachusetts. And then when my soon-to-be husband got orders with the Navy out to San Diego, we went out there. And so I was also an NEA member in California. And I taught high school. And then I took 7 full years off to have my kids. I taught a full day on a Friday, and I had my first son on a Monday. And then I didn't go back for 7 years. But towards the tail end of that time that I was at home, I got interested and involved in what was going on in the town where we had since purchased a home in Rhode Island because we moved back east after our 3 years in California. And I discovered that we had like pretty abysmal proficiency scores in math and reading. And I just started to get more informed about this new place I was living. And immediately I noticed that the expectations just seemed so low across the board compared to what I had been used to in this admittedly very affluent district in Massachusetts. So I ran for a school board seat. It was one of these weird times where it was actually a very competitive race, 4 people running for these 2 spots. And whereas like normally you can't you're like begging people to run for these offices and you can't get anybody to. But yeah, so I won the race by 43 votes. And so that was like my first foray into like public, I guess, service as it related to schools. And my like big focus was student achievement, which had not been really much of a topic at all prior. And luckily at the time I had there were people on the board at the same time that had the same priorities. And we definitely did move the needle, which was very gratifying. But I had 2 4 and 6-year-olds at the time. I don't know what I was thinking, running for school board in that situation. So I only did 1 term and then I came off. Then I went back to working in schools part-time from about 2010 to 2015. And then I haven't been in the classroom since 2015. I've worked in affluent districts, high poverty schools, parochial, charter, so I have a lot of lenses as a performer, educator, and then also, of course, as a parent.
Well, you joined what was then called Parents Defending Education at a time when parents were starting to realize that schools were teaching some pretty alarming stuff. perhaps you weren't as surprised as other parents because you did have this inside look as an educator, as a school board member.
No, I actually was pretty surprised because I feel like when schools went totally like bananas, that was like much more around like the 2020 timeframe. And I had come out of working in schools in 2015. So a lot of the most egregious things that we see now in terms of, keeping secrets from parents about their own children and this very sort of like race essentialist curriculum and this obsession with gender and sort of LGBTQ, et cetera, like themes. That's all pretty new, I feel like, at least around like the 2020 timeframe. So I hadn't seen it with my kids either. Certainly that one-off rogue thing, yes, I had seen that kind of thing, but I had never seen anything like what we began seeing, which was policies put in place that fixated on, I guess, what we would loosely call diversity, equity, and inclusion, and got us to a place where we were sort of like venerating people or denigrating people on the basis of their immutable characteristics in the public school system.
How did you become aware of that? Like, kind of like the rest of us, just as stories started trickling out, or social media posts?
That's a good question. Before Parents Defending Education, now Defending Education, even existed, I had begun to notice some very strange things happening in schools, just based, I guess, on like an online awareness. So people must have been posting things and writing things, and I was becoming aware of it. I had been working for an education advocacy place that had always like leaned to the left, but where I didn't feel like it was like an insane asylum until 2016, and that was when I felt like things got a little nutty. And where I would say something like, maybe, I don't know, like we probably shouldn't be treating people differently on the basis of race in schools, and that was like a problematic statement. So as I got sort of squeezed out and it just was no longer a fit, I remember I saw a story about, or not even a story, I came across documents that showed they were having like back to school meetings. I think they called them like community dialogues at a school in California. It was a private school, like a very expensive private school. And they had put out this schedule. So there were like all these little boxes with schedules, and everything was broken down by race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, et cetera. So it was like the Jewish parents would go in this room, Black parents would go in this room, Hispanic parents over here, LGBT, like it was the craziest thing I've seen. And I wrote about that, and that became like my like line in the sand. I understand there's a lot of pressure to think this is a good thing, and I am stating that this is a terrible thing. And it was kind of right after that just like that this organization was launching. And so it became like, oh, people knew that this organization was launching, and they knew me, and it felt like a bit of a fit. And that's how I joined 2 weeks before we like officially launched the organization.
And so what year was that?
Middle of March is when I came on board, and we launched the organization, I think March 31st of 2021.
Yeah, that was such a crazy time because we were so, for those of us in ridiculously unhealthy areas of the country, we were so dealing with school closures and just fighting to get our kids back in classrooms, while at the same time becoming aware of what was happening online in online classrooms, and then in the schools that were actually open at that time.
And my involvement it's not like I had terrible experiences as a parent. So for some people, it's like their advocacy came from the fact that really disturbing things were happening in their own kids' schools or in their own kids' classes or to their children.
Right.
That was not what drew me into this. It was much more of just me knowing what was happening in places, and in schools, and feeling like that conviction of the fact that like this is wrong. Having been in schools for, starting in the late 90s, I also knew like this is not normal. And I felt like what I was witnessing was words that sounded very virtuous and benign, and that there was, again, pressure to be on board with, that in practice were really harming kids.
So, Defending Education, where you are now, has a mission to expose and empower and engage. And you all do that through investigations and legal action and parent training. You're a very effective communicator, as are a number of your colleagues. So, you're out there in the media and on social media, exposing, empowering, and engaging. How do you prioritize what you focus on?
I mean, part of it is that we have different people on the team who are doing different things, right? So the
Okay.
person who's dealing with our legal stuff never really has to think about, oh, how are we going to expose this terrible survey that was given out in this school district that asks 6-year-olds about if they've ever, created a suicide plan and if they're transgender. But the other thing, I guess, is level of like how egregious is something. I have to confess, like, of course, there are parents that like reach out to us because they're bothered by something in their school. And as much as I sympathize with them, like, it's not always something that like we're going to be able to take on or even add to our website. Because for us to put things up on our website, we have to be able to corroborate it, vet it, and it has to be something that we think really crosses a line. And again, understandably, people draw their lines in different places.
Mhm.
So, if somebody's upset that their school is, reading some book in AP Lit that's been a book in AP Lit for 20 years, I'm sorry that they don't like the book, but like that's not something that we're taking on. Versus if students are being included and excluded in school activities or programs or events based on their race or ethnicity, well, that's something that we're going to take on, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, okay, I understand. You're saying it has to be something that you all can research and back up and prove and have documents and evidence of it, and that it also needs to rise to a certain level. Are there topics that you'd say that you focus on more than others? I'm hearing you say like things that might be violations of federal law when it comes to separating students out by affinity groups, by race, and then concerns about violations of parental rights when it comes to keeping secrets on gender identity, again, which are often violations of federal law, different
Yes.
federal laws. Are those the kind of criteria that you're looking at?
I mean, it doesn't always have to be that big. Like, for example, if we see a school district Facebook page that is all full of pictures of all the teachers with students that attended some big pride event on a weekend, like, we're probably going to put that on our website too,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because again, like, that's like, there's like a baked into the way that they write that up on their Facebook page. Like, what we're seeing is an ideology, and we're seeing a bias, and we're seeing words used that would clearly alienate a very large swath of the families in that school district. But yes, to your point, like when we see things that violate federal law, which is largely, I would say, going to be, Title VI, things related to discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or national origin, and Title IX, which would be the sex-based discrimination. Those are things that we're not only going to document on our website, but that our legal team, quote unquote, makes it sound a lot bigger than it is, but the people who specialize in the legal stuff that we do, that they would take a look at. Because whereas something might just rise to the level of, we're going to put it up on our website, up on our map, people can go, just sort of like see the documents or the assignments or the Facebook posts or the school board minutes or the policy, whatever it is, they can just see that for themselves. Sometimes it rises to the level where we decide to file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. Or if it's like, again, in the most egregious cases, we would actually file a lawsuit. And I'm not personally connected really to that piece of what we do, other than if I see something out there, I may be the person who like runs it up the chain. And then if they decide that it rises to the level of something, then they take over, and I have nothing to do with it other than, proofreading and editing the press release and potentially talking about it later in media.
You've been referring to your map and putting things up on the website. So I just want to flag for everyone that's the Indoctrination map, which is searchable by topic and by state. So if people are interested in finding out what's going on in their state, if they think, I live in Florida, it's fine. No, go to the map. It's not fine. There are going to be issues.
Yeah, that's actually been one of the most interesting, or I guess one of the myths that we have to debunk a lot is like, certainly there are places that are worse and better. That's true. So if you're in San Francisco versus like Tuscaloosa, like, yeah, but it's different. But on the other hand, it's totally untrue that we don't see a lot of very sort of racially divisive, or again, these gender policies that withhold information from parents, or these lessons about teaching young children that, you know, and I quote, you can be a boy or a girl or both or neither, and it's your choice. I mean, that's a very common lesson in some states. That is the state standard. They're supposed to teach that. Yeah. We see these kind of crazy lessons all over the country. Certainly not as much in the Sun Belt versus, you know, like a California, Minnesota, Massachusetts, New York. And I always say to people, like, it's not that it's not universal, but it is pervasive.
Yes, there's that Indoctrination map exposing all of that. Another resource that I point to that you all have is this analysis of these policies that do intentionally hide information from parents. And is it like over 1,000 school districts where you all have the evidence?
It's one of our most popular resources by far, because we basically just put the policy, the exact policy as written, on the website. And these, in order to be on this, we call it like a gender tracker. In order to be on this, you have to have written policies that openly state that district personnel can or should or must keep a student's new gender identity hidden from their parents. And when that's the case, that includes withholding all information from parents about the accommodations being provided by the school district. All right, so let me look. So as of right now, it's 1,215 districts, 21,314 schools, and over 12 million students affected.
This is where I think folks who might be more conservative, or just people who are genuinely concerned about the issue when it comes to gender identity, secrets from parents, might have this false sense of security that, well, President Trump passed some executive orders and we can say what we want on social media now. It's fine. We've won. No, we haven't. These policies are in place across the country, affecting millions of students. And the school district officials are violating federal laws like FERPA, and they're very proud of that. They don't plan to change their ways.
It's like part of the resistance. So there are places that were already much more sort of amenable to the idea of not doing these things. So when the executive order came down in those districts, again, largely in red states, they were much more willing to comply or able to comply, or because the state leadership also was on board with doing that. But anybody who lives in like a blue state, like I do, there's been no change as far as I can see since the executive orders related to these gender policies. I mean, actually, my district did do something, but it was sort of like, oh, it's okay that we're going to change ours because the state has its own and we can just sort of defer to that. So no, there's like a huge resistance. I believe right now, like maybe 26 states are in compliance and 24 are not, or something like that. So it's basically, like, we know, right? The country's split. It's about 50-50. And so that's what we see also with these policies. So certainly, like in my state, I believe it's been since, I'd have to check the date, but I want to say 2016, my state has had policies. The guidance from the State Department of Education down to the districts has been that children can change their gender at school, go by different names, different pronouns, etc. And if the child does not want the parents to know, the school will honor that request, and a child could be using different accommodations, restrooms, locker rooms, hotel rooms on overnight field trips, without the knowledge of their parents. And when people say to me, well, Erika, but like maybe the parents are dangerous and the school's just protecting the parents. Well, okay, fine. But then you'd have to be like, that means that then that if a kid says to you, you can't tell my parents my grades, you can't tell my parents what I got on this test, you can't send a report card home because they're going to be really mad and they don't agree. Because that's the same argument about the gender thing, right? My parents don't agree with this, so I don't want you to tell them. And if you tell them, like, then it's dangerous for me. So quite literally, I'm like, oh, and you also can't tell them that I was suspended, I got a D on my test. So it's just it's the only topic that schools willingly, deliberately deceive parents over.
You're talking about the resistance, and that sounds very familiar. I live in Northern Virginia, where there are 5 school districts, we call them divisions, who are resisting complying with state model policy and also with federal law on this. They were investigated by the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, and they're proud to be out of compliance with federal law. And they're wealthy districts for the most part. So even if they lose federal funding, which is the threat when you are out of compliance with federal law, investigated, and then there are findings, if they lose federal funding, they'll just raise taxes on their residents or whatever the process is to make up the money in some other way. So this idea of being part of the resistance, whether it's a district or a state, and being proud of it continues.
Yes.
So what are you all doing? From what I understand, there's a late October letter that Defending Education sent out to 50 states calling on state leaders to do some legal housekeeping and to audit their education laws to make sure that they are in compliance with federal law. But what prompted that? This idea of the resistance, or this awareness that some states might think that they're in compliance and they're not?
What actually prompted this is the crazy superintendent story out of Des Moines, Iowa, where we found out, right, that he was in the country illegally. We found out that he had fled immigration officials in a school district issued vehicle, and that when he abandoned the car and took off, they found a loaded gun and $3,000 in cash in the car. And then as people looked more, it turns out, he also lied on his resume. He also never got that doctorate at that school where he said he did. And he also lied about awards that he was given. It was just it basically was like a con man who had checked all the right identity boxes and had dazzled the all-female school board in Des Moines, who, despite knowing that he had not been honest on his resume, hired him anyway. And now they're in the midst of this hugely embarrassing debacle. And he's been arrested. I think he's in jail or something. I don't even know. So for us, it was there's a vetting problem here. But the other thing we discovered as we looked into this was not only did the district where he worked, so Des Moines, have in their strategic plan that they would be, that their teachers and their administration would be 40% people of color by 2030. So they had racial quotas in place, written down. But what we also then realized, because our researcher, Ryan, is so amazing, that we had already put out a report about the state of Iowa and the affirmative action law in the state that was basically making school districts do race-based hiring. And guess what? Des Moines was in that report. So it was okay, there's there were a couple things. One was these are school districts are all at risk of losing federal funding. And certainly that's worth flagging. But they're also jeopardizing student safety. Where are the child safeguards when your vetting is this pathetic? And when you are you know, almost so obsessed with these identity markers in the name of DEI that you're making hires that end up, revealing themselves to have been beyond just bad hires. So we also saw just a couple weeks ago, the former superintendent in Evanston, Illinois. Now, he was the one that got famous because he said that they were going to, during COVID, they were going to let kids come back to in-person schooling on the basis of race and sexual orientation to make up for historical wrongs. So in writing, this guy, who's also now been arrested because he's been indicted on 17 counts of like embezzlement or something, again, checked all the right boxes and was a national embarrassment because he was gonna, quite literally, oh, you're a struggling reader, but you're a heterosexual fifth grader who's white, you can't come back to school. Oh, you're like top of the class, but you're gay or you're black, okay, you get to come back to school. That is literally what this said. So anyway, so we sent out a letter, and it basically just says, we sent the letter along with, I think 26 other local parent groups in the different states, calling on them to conduct a top to bottom audit of their education laws and policies to ensure compliance with federal civil rights and constitutional protections. And that means if they have state laws or policies in place that discriminate based on race, sex, national origin, religion, or violate federal law, obviously, they need to fix that.
The other day, I just heard a story from Wisconsin where a dyslexic child was not being tested. The mother knew that something was wrong because the child wasn't learning how to read and the child wasn't being tested. The parent kept trying to get resources allocated for their child and was informed by the school that the school policy was to prioritize based on race. And they actually had a spreadsheet identifying the race of the students who were struggling readers and who was going to be tested. So there are stories across the country. There's evidence.
Los Angeles had a program that was a remediation program, but you had to be Black to be in it. No other student, even if they needed remediation, could be in it. We filed a complaint about that, and they actually did have to walk that back. Chicago also has the same, almost an identical program. And again, like, number one, it's just against the law, right? And what I actually said this on in another interview recently, that what I've learned over the past 4 years is that a lot of school officials and reporters do not know that the Civil Rights Act applies to everybody. Because originally the Civil Rights Act, right, we passed it because we had discrimination, that whites were given rights that Black people and others, but at the time we were mostly talking about Black Americans, didn't have. So in that sense, it makes sense that a person thinks of like civil rights law, right, as applying to people who aren't white. But the civil rights law applies to everybody, and it means you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, period. And what has happened is that now, as we've seen so much more discrimination in the opposite direction, right, where they're including certain groups and excluding others based on race, and currently the most common is for white students or white staff to be excluded. I get a lot of pushback when I do interviews about that because their understanding of these laws is that they don't apply to white Americans. Or, and this I actually prefer, they might say, well, I wish they didn't apply. They should, I wish it wasn't that way. That's actually much more, at least that's honest, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I wish we could discriminate in this way because I think it's necessary for students and staff. That's a way better conversation than like pretending that it's not against the law. But again, I of course would argue it's always wrong to discriminate on the basis of race. And one of the reasons why is because you would end up getting back to the very thing that we were trying to get away from in 1964. Right? Because at some point when you keep discriminating on the basis of race, you send a message that it's okay to do that. And pretty soon, you're going to start seeing some of the same horrific patterns that we were trying to get away from by passing that law. So anyway, it's just kind of been stunning. Reporters love to be like, "Oh, so you're just upset that like white kids are excluded?" I'm like, no. It's that there's a federal violation here going on, and if you play the tape forward, this could get very bad and very ugly very quickly.
I wanted to wrap up with you addressing a common myth when it comes to parental rights or enforcement of these federal civil rights laws. I feel like you just addressed one there with this misconception that the law only applies to one race. Is there another myth that you'd want to tackle? Something else that you're hearing commonly from reporters?
Well, they also don't seem to know that Title IX also applies to males and females. Again, like Title IX was a 37-word law that says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. Now, again, why did we have it? Because at the time, girls and women were being discriminated against, right? Like my mother and grandmother, like there were like no sports for them to even play. But it actually applies also to everybody. So when we see Girls Who Code, Girls on the Run, Girls Leadership Academy, and all of these public schools, and everyone's like, rah, rah, that's so great. You go, girl. Future is female. Woo! But the problem is, if you don't have any sort of parallel, similar program for the boys in the school, like technically that is also a Title IX violation. Now, at the moment, we've got other big problems related to Title IX that have to do with like males being allowed in single sex spaces and stealing podium spots from female athletes. So what I just said about the boys hasn't really been the priority, and that's understandable because from a safety perspective, obviously, this is a way bigger problem that's facing girls and women right now. But it is wrong to think that Title IX only applies to girls and women because it actually applies to everybody. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news.
And understandable as the mother of 3 sons and somebody who is very grounded in common sense and now also in the federal laws. So how can people follow your work?
Our website is defendinged.org, and we've got tons of resources for parents and for parent groups. Certainly reach out to us anytime. There's a way to like send us a tip, quote unquote, if you have a question or you need something. You can find me. I have a Substack, sanzi.substack.com. It's called Sanzi Says. I write very intermittently, so it's all free because I could never charge for such an inconsistent product. And I'm on Twitter/X at esanzi.
Well, Erika, thank you for your commitment to parental rights, to common sense policies, and to students. And thank you for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to see you.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. Learn more about our work at dfipolicy.org. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Send feedback, questions, and episode ideas to podcast@dfipolicy.org. And if you enjoyed today's conversation, please follow and review Freedom to Learn on your favorite podcast app and share it with a friend.